So good afternoon, President Laura, fellow Rotarians, and honored guests. If you Google best-selling author John Shelby Spong, you will find a lot of descriptions. Some of them nice, some of them not very nice. Rogue priest, Anglican nightmare, brilliant scholar, progressive Christian, inclusive, fearless. Jack was the Episcopal Bishop of Newark, New Jersey for 24 years. He has written 24 books, and we'll talk about the newest one in just a bit. I invited Jack here today partly because of something he told me 9 years ago. He'd written a book called The Sins of Scripture. I interviewed him, and then afterward, as we were walking out of the studio, almost as an aside, he said, "You know, the same-sex marriage issue is done. It's over. It's decided. It will come to pass." And I thought, wow, that is like a borderline crazy thing to say. 9 years ago, if you think about what the landscape looked like, and here we are 9 years later, and he was right. So not only was Jack a compelling interview, he proved he was ahead of his time back then, and he's still sticking his neck out today. So we're going to cover a lot of ground, including the friend named Desmond Tutu that Jack gave respite to during apartheid and then ordained as a bishop, who would go on to world recognition and admiration. But I want to start, as they say, in the beginning. Let's give a warm Seattle Rotary welcome to Jack Spong. Right now, let's welcome Jack. I would also like to recognize Jack's wife, Christine. Christine, would you stand up? Jack's editor and all-around great manager. So I want to start in the beginning. We talked on the phone about 40 minutes the other day from your home in New Jersey, and I was really struck by what you told me about the early part of your connection to the church and the atmosphere growing up in the South. So why don't you begin there, what your early beginnings were like?
Thank you, Mark. Let me say first that when you come to a Rotary Club where an atheist leads you in singing songs about God and Jesus, and then you hear a talk like Darlene's talk, I'm convinced that the kingdom of God might break in this club and sweep through all the world. I'm delighted to be here. I was raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, literally about a block from the home of Billy Frank Graham, who's achieved great fame. And I was raised in a church that taught me that segregation was the will of God, that women were by nature inferior to men, that it was okay to hate other religions, and especially the Jews, and that homosexuals were either mentally sick or morally depraved. And they quoted the Bible to prove each of these contentions. So I've spent a great deal of my life overcoming the things that I learned in Sunday school, because I think they violate everything that is true about the Christian faith. I've even gotten to the place, Mark, where I respect atheists because what they're telling me is that they don't believe in the God that they've run into in the Christian church. There are lots of times I don't either. I don't even like religious people. The more religious you are, the less I like you, and that's an occupational hazard for people in my profession. But I think we've got to address some real big issues, and I think that it's important to address them head on. I've received 16 death threats in my life that were legitimate enough to turn over to authorities. None of them ever came from an atheist or a Buddhist. All of my death threats came from Bible-quoting, true-believing Christians. I think we ought to go to school on that.
So you say a turning point for you was reading a book early in, I think it was the 1960s, Honest of God. Tell us about that and how that had an impact on you.
Have any of you ever heard of the book Honest to God by John A.T. Robinson? Yeah, there are a few of the faithful out there. John A.T. Robinson was an English bishop in the Diocese of Suffolk in South London. And he wrote a book called Honest to God, in which he brought to the attention of the average person in the street 3 streams of Christian thinking that had been developing in the 21st century. One was the thinking of Paul Tillich, who was moving beyond conceiving of God as a theistic supernatural being Another was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was coining the phrase religionless Christianity, or Christianity without religion. And the third was a German New Testament scholar named Rudolf Bultmann, who coined the phrase demythologizing the scriptures. Now, all of these three people I'd read many times, but I'd never put all three of them together. And John Robinson put them together and created a mighty tide that began to sweep over organized Christian circles. John's book sold more copies than any religious book since Pilgrim's Progress, and that takes in a lot of territory. And of course, he was ostracized by the Anglican Church, my church, my communion. The Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced him a heretic, and they marginalized him. He never was able to advance in the ranks of the Church of England in the way that somebody with his background should have advanced. And he died a broken man in 1963, generally unappreciated by the church that he has served all his life, because he challenged too much of their basic structure. But he opened the door for people to look at Christianity in a brand new way. I mean, we would go to England and the cab drivers would ask me about Bishop Robinson. I'd never had a cab driver ask me about any theologian before. You'd go into a pub and all these men were drinking their pints, and they were all talking about John A.T. Robinson and his understanding of God and the Bible, and it was just a right remarkable revolution. I read that book in 1965, 2 years after it came out, and I was on my way to become the rector of St. John's Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I was going to share that town with a young Baptist preacher named Jerry Falwell. And it was a really eye-opening experience. And I decided at that point that Lynchburg ought to have at least one church where people could raise questions and raise doubts and not have to twist their brains into first-century pretzels in order to come to worship. And so I began to do that in this very conservative southern city. And the response was incredible. That is, people came out of the woodwork. Now, some left, and not everybody was happy with that. But people came out of the woodwork in this conservative southern town, and our church just grew tremendously, but it grew with a whole different kind of person. These were people for whom church life and Christianity itself had little appeal until they confronted something that was a little bit different. That gave me a great deal of courage and changed the course of my life rather dramatically.
And you incorporated that into adult classes in the church that suddenly became crowded.
I began to teach an adult Bible class, and that sounds like a really radical communist thing to do, doesn't it, to go teach an adult Bible class. But I taught it the same way I would later teach it at Harvard Divinity School or Union Theological Seminary in New York, because I don't think that lay people's brains have atrophied. I didn't see any reason why the lay people in Lynchburg, Virginia couldn't learn everything that I'd learned in my academic career. And I began to open some doors that people had never seen before, and to look at issues, particularly biblical issues. How many of you really think there were wise men that followed a star that wandered so slowly through the sky that they could keep up with it? How many of you really believe that's possible? But how many people raise questions about that? And how many people really do think that angels can break through the darkness of the sky and sing, probably in Aramaic, to hillside shepherds to announce the birth of Jesus? And is that literal history? And how many of you believe that a man who's been dead for 4 days, whose body has already begun to decay, his sister says in King James English, "Don't open that tomb, Jesus, for already he stinketh." That's what the King James Bible says. And yet Jesus raises this man from the dead, says this story, in a great big public occasion, and nobody even writes about that for 65 years. How many people think that's possible? Well, if those things aren't possible, maybe there's another way to read the Bible that we have not ever had presented to us today. And it's to try to bring people into that other possibility. The wise man was originally a sermon preached on Isaiah 60. I'm sure all of you immediately pull Isaiah 60 out of your brains, and so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But Isaiah 60 says that kings shall come to the brightness of God's rising. They will come on camels. They will come from Sheba, and they're going to bring gold and frankincense. Now, doesn't that sound just a little bit familiar? And that story was turned by that early Christian preacher into this narrative that Matthew writes. And he's not talking about history. He's trying to interpret an experience, and that's a very different way to look at the Bible. And I think people, when they begin to understand that, find the Bible something that's sort of worthwhile.
You knew Desmond Tutu before he became a bishop and a household name. Take me back to that time where he actually came to your church to get away from
My
death
diocese.
threats.
Yeah, Desmond was the dean of St. John's Cathedral in Johannesburg. I was in South Africa right after the Soweto riots, where the police from South Africa, from Johannesburg, had gone into the black communities, Soweto, which stood for Southwest Township. They didn't even give it the dignity of a name. It was a suburb of Johannesburg. And there'd been youth riots there, and the police had moved in and simply, sort of like Syria today, they just sort of mowed down the opposition. And there was something like 200 or 300 teenage kids that were hauled onto flatbed trucks. Their bodies were hauled onto flatbed trucks and taken down to the funeral home, and parents were called to come down and go through these stacks of bodies to identify their own sons and daughters. It was a rather incredible time in history. And Desmond, as the dean of the cathedral, and refusing to live in the deanery, he lived in Soweto, became the voice of the Soweto riots, and that's the way he rose into prominence. And so we were there with Desmond about 2 weeks after these riots had come to their conclusion. And he was clearly a star rising. He had been chosen by the Anglican Church to be the bishop of a tiny little Bantu land in South Africa. Lesotho, it was called. We called him Tutu of Lesotho. And he thought that was very clever and suggested that I might someday become Spong of Hong Kong, but I never did. But in any event, one of the ways you get rid of troublemakers is you make them bishops and send them off to the hinterlands, and Desmond, in effect, had that happening to him. His was a diocese there. He had to get to most of his congregations either on the back of a mule or by walking. It was a very primitive place. But we had to be consecrated to a bishop, and there were 9 of us there, 9 bishops of the Anglican Communion. And so we were the 9 people who laid our hands on his head and made him a bishop of Lesotho. He stayed there only about 3 years, and then he became the executive secretary of the South Africa Council of Churches, where he took on a national role. And from there, he was elected bishop of Johannesburg, and finally he became the archbishop of the Anglican Church, living in Cape Town. Now, during the time that he was the controversial leader, I always thought his life was in danger. And so, because of our friendship, I invited him to spend a month at a time in the Diocese of Newark under the guise of being the assistant bishop of Newark to help me with confirmations. But the real reason was to get him out of South Africa for some R&R. And his wife Leah came with him, and his children from time to time came with him. He's one of the truly authentic and great human beings that I've ever known, and I'm really privileged to be able to say he's my friend.
And he even came after getting the Nobel Prize, kept a commitment to speak at your church.
He was speaking in one of the churches of my diocese, and he won the Nobel Prize, and he flew home to Johannesburg because he wanted to share that with his people. Those kinds of prizes are never individual rewards. The individual is the symbol of a movement. And so he felt a responsibility to share it. And so he flew there, and he flew back, and that's not a short journey. That's the southern hemisphere as well as on another continent. And my wife met him at the airport to bring him out to the church where he was speaking. And he went to sleep in the car, so I've told people that Desmond has slept with my wife, which is literally true, but it was in the car. And he fulfilled that obligation, and that's just the kind of human being he is, a remarkable human being. And I think one of the great things that's happened in human history that I'm aware of is that when the black community achieved political power in South Africa, and they had that incredibly, almost Christ-like figure, Nelson Mandela, who became their president, and there was a great deal of fear in South Africa, and especially white fear. And that's when he decided to approach what he called reconciliation. And they passed a law that said anybody who is accused by a person of color of having violated them during the period of apartheid, if that person would just confront his accuser and admit that he had done it, there would be no charges. And he put Desmond in charge of this this process. I've never known a nation that went through a bloodless revolution like the one that brought black people to power and that maintained its equilibrium with such a incredible, marvelous spirit. Nelson Mandela is a really a marvelous human being, and Desmond is sort of his prime minister. They work together very closely.
I want to get back to the issue of same-sex marriage. How did you know 9 years ago that the issue would come to pass?
Well, prejudices are funny if you look at them. Prejudices are always built on an assumed presupposition in the culture. And the presupposition that we had in recent years about gay and lesbian people is that they chose their sexual orientation. Well, that didn't make any sense to me as I began to learn some things about sexual orientation, because I didn't choose my sexual orientation. It just never occurred to me to think that you would choose it. And I tell people that I woke up sometime between age 12 and 13, and suddenly girls did not seem obnoxious to me any longer. I didn't make a decision about that. I didn't sit on the side of the bed and say, oh, I'll decide to be heterosexual. I didn't even know what heterosexual meant. I didn't know what homosexual meant either. We didn't have any of those in the South. That was another cultural norm. And so as I came to an awareness that the gay and lesbian people I knew were neither mentally sick nor morally depraved, that they were simply different, and you can be different and not be abnormal. I mean, left-handed people are different. So are red-headed people. There are a lot of people that are different in a lot of ways. That doesn't make you abnormal. And this is part of the growing process. Anyway, I got to the place, I was elected bishop in Newark, and in the South, as I say, I never really engaged the gay issue because we didn't have any gay people. I look back on my life in Richmond, Virginia. We had 5 socially acceptable bachelors on my vestry of 12 men. It was all male vestry, and 5 of them were socially acceptable bachelors who were known in town as they're not the marrying kind. But they never said they were homosexual, and they served a very social purpose. They escorted the socially acceptable widows and socially acceptable divorcees to socially acceptable Richmond parties. And they were they played a vital social role. It never occurred to me or anybody else that I know to think that maybe one of them might have been gay. Now, the statistics that all 5 of them were straight would be astronomical. It'd be millions to 1. But I don't mean to say that anybody who's not married is necessarily homosexual, but I'd say when you get a significant number of gay people, of unmarried males together, the possibility is that maybe one or more of them is gay. So, you know, I became the bishop, and all of a sudden, I was in a state of New Jersey where people weren't embarrassed to be homosexual. You know, where I grew up from, you sort of had to be embarrassed. You should not want to admit it. You should stay in hiding. And so people began to come out to me, and they violated all my stereotypes. They were whole people. They were outstanding people. Many of them were clergy. I'd never known a homosexual priest. So I've come a long way. That was in 1976. And by the mid-'80s, I became, in effect, the point guard for the revolution against the prejudices of homophobia in my church, and that battle is over. It's been won. When I retired as the Bishop of Newark, 35 of my clergy were out of the closet, gay and lesbian clergy, and 31 of them lived openly with their partners, and I've never had a complaint from anybody about them. Nobody ever questioned their sexual behavior. Now, I must say that I had about 1,000 priests in my career as a bishop, and I can't say that about my heterosexual clergy. I had a couple of heterosexual clergy that seemed to like the sopranos in their choirs better than their wives or something like that. But I never had a complaint of sexual impropriety with any of my gay and lesbian clergy. The church I attend in Morristown has a lesbian assistant who is married and who has a daughter. And she is just one of the finest clergy persons I've ever known. I'm just very fond of her. And so, you know, my experience just changed the way I'd been taught, and I recommend that experience to people.
Just a brief follow-up. You said that you think that within 5 years, even in the Deep South, same-sex marriage will be legal?
I think so. Texas, Mississippi, South Carolina, you name it, they're all going to fall. and they're going to fall by the decision of the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, this is a very conservative Supreme Court. But it's still going to fall because you cannot do what they did in their 2 recent decisions and then continue to uphold discrimination. The die has been cast. It's just a matter of living into it. It may take 1 or 2 more Supreme Court deaths while we don't have Rick Perry as our president before we can be certain of that. But I'm just sure that the Supreme Court is going to invalidate all the state laws against same-sex marriage, and they're going to do it very soon. And the fascinating thing is that when it happens, it's going to be over in a moment, and nobody is going to be terribly upset about it because the world has already changed in a rather dramatic way. My state of New Jersey is the only state in the Northeast that does not allow same-sex marriage. And we don't because our governor is running for president. He's a Republican, and he vetoed it when it passed the state legislature, and he wants to put it into a referendum. That's what politicians call rear-end covering. I would use other words, but that's what it is. And so he's and frankly, I think Chris Christie is probably the healthiest Republican I see seeking the presidency. I think most of them are crazy.
I don't want to jump in here to change the subject, Jack, but but hey, look, a squirrel. No, I'm kidding. So you know what? I love your honesty, and I was just joking because when I get nervous, I joke. But I think you have a good point. I want to talk about you've 24 books in your career. So you have a lot of critics who say you're reinterpreting the Bible in a way that shouldn't be reinterpreted. I want to make sure we have some time here to talk about your latest book. It's called The Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic. You spent 5 years and you read every commentary.
Major commentary.
There's a
lot of difference.
From the 18th century to present on the book of John.
Yep.
Use that as an example to tell all of the folks here your life work and how you perceive the quote-unquote reinterpretation of the Bible.
Well, that's sort of a nice subject for the 2-minute response, but I'll try. I really love the Bible, but I don't love the Bible that I learned about as a child. I love the Bible I've learned about later in my life. And as I said on your program this morning, Mark, what most people do is they homogenize the Scriptures. They don't see them as separate books. If you're Protestant, there are 66 separate books in the Bible. If you're Catholic, they have the Apocrypha, too, that are added in. But they're all written in a different place at a different time, under different circumstances. The one thing they have in common is that they're all written by Jews. That's something Christians have a hard time embracing. Every book in the Bible is written by a Jew. And they think like Jews, and they have a Jewish worldview, and they're shaped by Jewish worship, and they are shaped by their Jewish scriptures. There's only debate about one of the authors of the New Testament, and that's Luke. And Luke appears to have been born a Gentile and converted to Judaism before he came into Christianity. So all of the authors of the Bible are Jewish people, except by birth, except Luke, and he's Jewish by conversion. That's a pretty good amount of territory. Well, if you don't read these books as Jewish books and understand what you're talking about in those books, then I don't think you're ever going to do that. Now, how do Jews write sacred stories? Well, they use a lot of exaggeration. If they want to tell you that this is not history, they use a lot of exaggeration. That's what the Jonah story is in the Old Testament. I mean, how many of you really think there's a big fish out there that's big enough to swallow a person whole, and they can live in that fish's stomach for 3 days until even the fish gets sick of them and throws them up? That's what the story of Jonah says. Well, the Jews would use exaggeration when they were trying to say to their audience, where we might say once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after, and you would know this is not to be taken literally, the Jews would use exaggeration. Well, look at John's Gospel for a minute. I'll get there before you ask me a question. Now, it's filled with 2 things. One is making fun of people who are literal, and the other is exaggeration. Look at the story of turning water into wine. That's a favorite story. It doesn't appear in any gospel except John. But Jesus doesn't just turn water into wine. He turns it into 160 gallons of wine. Folks, that'll keep a party going a very long time. And it's not just cheap wine. This is not Gallo screw-top gallon jug wine. This is Robert Mondavi's best. This is the Côte de Rhône at its maximum. This is an exaggerated story, and that's the signal that you ought to not take this story literally. Keep reading John, and he doesn't just have Jesus just cure a person who's crippled. He cures a cripple who's been crippled for 38 years. Jesus doesn't just give sight to a blind man in John's gospel. He gives sight to a man who was born blind. Jesus doesn't just raise somebody from the dead. He raises from the dead a man who's been dead 4 days, in his grave 4 days, and already decaying. Everything is exaggerated. Secondly, in John's gospel, he makes fun of literal people. They're all over the place. Chapter 3, there's the story of Nicodemus. Nicodemus doesn't appear in any gospel except John. And Nicodemus and Jesus are having a conversation. Jesus says to him, Nicodemus, you don't understand because you've got to be born again. He didn't mean go out and have an evangelical conversion experience. He meant you've got to come to a whole new way of looking at things. And Nicodemus is a literalist. He says, born again? I'm a grown man. I can't climb back up into my mother's womb and be born again. John makes fun of that mentality. In the next chapter, and I won't go through all of them, but in the next chapter, chapter 4, Jesus is having a conversation with the Samaritan woman by the well and turns on the symbol of water. Jesus asks her for a drink, and then they talk. And Jesus says to her, or John has Jesus say to her, if you knew who it was that was talking to you, you would ask him for water, and he would give you living water. And she looks at him and says, man, you don't even have a bucket. That's literalism. And then the disciples show up, and they're sort of offended, not that Jesus is talking to a Samaritan, but that he's talking to a woman. And the disciples bring some food, and they try to make Jesus eat. And Jesus says to them, folks, I've got food of which you do not know. And the disciples are literalists. They say, I wonder who brought him all that food. John constantly makes fun of people who would read the text literally. And John uses exaggeration over and over again to tell you that you do not read this story literally. This is not history. This is not biography. This is an interpretive portrait of an experience that people have had with a person named Jesus of Nazareth that has been transformative. And when you can open the book to that sort of understanding, I think it reads with great integrity and great power.
So the book is the fourth gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic. Karen Allman from Elliott Bay is selling copies after the meeting out here, and John will be signing those. I don't think we have time for Q&A because it would not be possible. Don't be sorry. This has been fantastic. This might be tacky, but I'm going to take a risk. How do you feel about a lightning round? I pepper questions. You give me very short answers.
I'll try.
Okay.
That's not something my profession is good at.
Do you believe in heaven?
I would have to define heaven. I don't believe in heaven as, this is not a thing, I don't believe in heaven as a place of reward. I don't believe in hell as a place of punishment. I think that's nothing but the church trying to control behavior here and now, and has very little to do with what I understand life beyond this life to be.
What do you think happens when we die?
I don't have any idea.
Why
And
are
anybody that doesn't know any more than I know.
why are good people allowed to suffer?
Oh God, Mark, that's
Remember, seven
that's
words,
the perennial.
Jack.
That's a perennial question that people ask, and I don't think it's been answered. I don't think Harold Kushner's book answered it. I don't think the book of Job answered it, but I think the book of Job may be the best way to get into that subject.
Why are some prayers answered and others are not?
Well, I'm not sure that any are answered in the way people think. I just think that that's the way they interpret life. But it's inevitable that, if you change planes and the plane you were on goes down in a crash, you ask some existential questions about why you're still around. And I think that's inevitably human, but I don't think that's a thing we could answer very briefly.
What's your view on tithing?
I support it. It's very important in my profession. God loves a cheerful giver, but the church will accept from grouches.
And I'm going to end with a more serious question. What do you hope your legacy is?
I would hope, someone asked me when I was elected bishop what I hoped would I be able to accomplish. And I said, when I retire, I'd like to think that the people of the Diocese of Newark were at least more biblically literate and biblically educated than I had been when I started out my career. If I could sum up my sort of personal creed, I think of God as the source of life, and that God calls me to live fully. I think of God as the source of love, and that love compels me to love beyond all of my barriers and boundaries and prejudices. And I think of God as the ground of being, and that God gives me the courage to be all that I can be and frees me to enable others to be all that they can be without imposing my stereotypes upon them. And what the God I see in Jesus is a God who is fully alive, totally loving, and capable of being everything that he wants, that he was created to be. And to me, that's the goal of the Christian faith. It's not to make you religious. God knows we've got enough religion in this world. It's to make you whole, to set you free, to enable you to be everything that you're capable of being. And the text, because every preacher has to have a text, my text for that is in John's Gospel, where Jesus is quoted as saying, "My purpose is not to make you religious or moral or righteous or give you the truth. My purpose is to give you life and to give it abundantly." I think that's the only job the Christian church has, to expand the lives of every child of God to the maximum that they're capable, and calling them to live and to love and to be. And that's the kind of Christianity that compels me to stay with this wonderful, wretched church that we have, and to continually to work for its reformation. Thank you.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.